Sorry, we were talking a lot. Today's Tuesday, February 18th, 2025, and our friend Colonel Wilkerson is back with us. Welcome back there.
Thank you. I'll tell your audience that I had you, we were laughing at one another, trying to figure out how Spanish is spoken, how Portuguese is spoken, etc.
Yeah. Larry, let's get started with what's going on in Saudi Arabia. The meeting between two delegations from the United States and Russia without having Europeans and Ukraine to be part of that. How did you find it?
Well, obviously, President Macron found it to be not to his liking, so he held a meeting in Paris, which one of my good friends who knows Europe better than I said this morning. He quoted Horace, which in the poem sort of turns out like this: they went to the mountain and they met a mouse. That's what Macron achieved in Paris. Nobody gave him any real heed. But yeah, this is a meeting that I think is part of Trump's plan, and I don't object to it. I don't know what's going to happen there. I wish I did, but I don't object to it. He's going there, or his envoys are going there, and Sergei Lavrov and Putin's envoys are going there. Maybe Lavrov even, I don't know. I haven't heard anything definitive about the Russian delegation yet, but they're going there to talk about what is central to them. And as far as they're concerned, they need to do it without interference from the EU or the Europeans, or even for that matter from NATO, and without any interference from Zelensky in particular, but Ukraine in general. I don't discount that. A good first move. Why they picked Saudi Arabia, I guess, has to be because Trump is so fond of Saudi Arabia and its money.
Larry, do you think that the way that Europeans are trying to unite against the policy of Donald Trump in terms of not considering them to be part of these negotiations, do you think they would achieve something? Does Donald Trump or his administration care about what Europeans are talking about or thinking of at this stage of the negotiations?
Well, I think Anatole Levin got it right in his piece this morning, quoting Horace. They went to make a mountain and they didn't even make a mouse turd. That's what Europe's role in this probably is going to wind up being, because Donald Trump's not going to want to be interfered with. And I don't blame him from the perspective that as he's watched this develop from his perch in the campaign and now from being inaugurated, the Europeans have been nothing but a problem, especially Germany, France, Britain at the peak. Britain, who offers 100-day treaties for an army that you could put in a thimble. So I wouldn't want to be beleaguered by them either, were I going straight for the heart of things. Now, I don't for a moment pretend that Donald Trump is going to achieve going straight for the heart of things, because he's his own worst enemy. But this is a good way to start, in my view.
We know that we've learned today that, again, Keith Kellogg would be responsible. They're talking about Keith Kellogg being responsible for negotiations with Russians again. And here, Witkoff and together with Rubio and, pardon me, and Mike Waltz, they started negotiation talking with Russian, but the one who's going to be responsible for negotiation would be Keith Kellogg. Here is what he said. I'm emphasizing his name because here is what he said at the Munich Security Conference in terms of concessions on both parts.
Right.
Putin have to make?
Well, when you know, to me, there's going to have to be things like territorial concessions as well. Okay, it's somewhat is unrealistic to expect where you'd want to go to, but it's territorial. It's some territorial. It could be the engagement of refusing to use force, renouncement of the use of force into the future from a political side. He's not going to downsize his military forces, hopefully get rid of. What we're going to try to do is basically force him into actions. What you want to do is force him to actions maybe he's uncomfortable with. What I mean by that is an example. Right now is what we're going to do is try to break this alliance that he currently has. He's got an alliance around with North Korea that wasn't there before. He's got an alliance with Iran that wasn't there before. He's got an alliance with China that wasn't there before, meaning 4 years ago before. But let me.
Yeah.
You want a one-word answer to my appreciation of those comments? Absurd. He's operating in the theater of the absurd. And I don't mean necessarily Jean-Paul Sartre's theater or Albert Camus' theater of the absurd. That was an artistic concept that worked fairly well. He's in a true theater of the absurd. Lavrov will eat his lunch, and probably almost any other Russian negotiator worth Putin's time will eat his lunch. I can't believe that he's even the negotiator, if that's his attitude.
The way that he's thinking of the conflict is so simplistic, and the way that he's talking territorial concession. How is that going to work out? What do they have as leverage to put pressure on Russia in terms of doing that?
What he was saying, or implying at least, and I know that's a short clip, so I'm being somewhat unfair to him, but I know him from previous incarnations. If they are thinking that they are going to do through negotiations what Biden and Blinken and Sullivan and Newland and all the rest of the morons running our policy with respect to NATO and Ukraine for the 4 years of the Biden administration through negotiations, that they're going to cause Russia to do things like break up its alliances, back away from people like Iran, like China. He didn't say China, nor others. That's nonsense. That's sheer nonsense. You're not going to use these negotiations to do anything other than stop the killing in Ukraine, recognize that Russia has won, and get out the best way you possibly can otherwise. That's the only way you're going to do this with Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov. That's it. So to think the insinuation there is that we're going to solve all these other problems we couldn't solve through bleeding Ukraine bloodless by negotiations. I hope Trump hasn't been saying that sort of thing to him or to anyone for that matter. You're not going to do that, Donald. And that means if he doesn't get anywhere close to that, he'll, like he did with Kim Jong-un, just abandon it and leave it hanging in the wind. And that's not what we want here. We want a ceasefire, an end of the war, a peace agreement, and something that we can live with. We and the Europeans can live with, despite the Europeans' objections to it. They're going to have to live with it, particularly if Trump carries out some of the things Hegseth and J.D. Vance have said that portend for the U.S., NATO, U.S., European relationship. Ain't going to be the same in the future, ladies and gentlemen.
In terms of Europeans, what do they have to bring to the table in any sort of negotiation? And what is Europe, Larry? I'm asking everybody, who's Europe? Who is it Macron, Olaf Scholz? Is it Orban, Fico? Who's Europe right now? And how Donald Trump can have a single, or he's gonna talk with each and every one of these European countries. It's a very difficult task on the part of the US government if they want to talk with Europeans and find out how do they feel about Ukraine.
Yes. And part of that problem is of our own making, because through the years, especially the latter years of the Cold War and just afterwards, we have become almost what do you call those things that little children have that they depend on all the time? Blinkies or something like that. NATO has become a blinky for Europe. They reach out for it. They don't do anything on their own. They can't think on their own. They can't make product on their own. They can't do defense matters on their own. They reach out to Washington all the time. No one's more exemplifying that than London. Well, they've got to get off that. And they've got to decide what they're going to do. Are we going to talk to 30 some odd different countries? Or are we going to talk to Berlin? Are we going to talk to an axis between Berlin and Paris? Are we going to talk to something else that might be created? I don't know. As I've said many times, there needs to be a substantial effort by European leaders of consequence to establish a European security architecture. But I don't see anyone with the cojones, even, let alone the intellectual weight to do that. We don't have the kind of people we had, for example, when I was dealing with the Europeans. Francois Mitterrand, Helmut Kohl, John Major, Maggie Thatcher, a host of other people in other countries who were as concerned with their own security and their own country's domestic and foreign situation as they were with NATO. Now we have people who are only concerned with the United States getting them out of every stinking mess they might get themselves into. Maybe we bred this with the Balkans. I don't know. It's not going to happen. And it's certainly not going to happen with Donald Trump. If they turn on themselves now and just wind up in some kind of internecine European typical struggle, he'll back out completely. He'll leave completely. We'll have an economic relationship, a trade relationship, and he'll start putting tariffs on them big time too. But we won't have any other kind of relationship. And that's probably dangerous, I think. We need to maintain some kind of transatlantic link, and it needs to be reasonably sound. And it needs to be a little bit more than just economics and finance. But I'm afraid we might be headed for that. It's going to depend to a certain extent on Macron is not the leader of France. He is not. They've shown that now. For weeks on end, they've shown that. He needs to get out. They need to have a new government. Certainly the chancellor of Germany is not their leader. And February 23rd, we're going to find out. We're going to ripple through these elections and other people are going to be elected. I don't know what's going to happen in Romania where Colin is running and should be the lead candidate if it weren't for the EU and the CIA messing up the elections. That'd be another Orban. So we've got to move away from the old world and into the new world, the existing world. And Europe's got to make that move pretty fast, or they're just going to be a squabbling bunch of idiots, which is pretty much what I think to the world they are beginning to look like right now.
They want to impose a new set of sanctions on Russia, which Rubio and the Trump administration are not agreeing on that sort of attitude because they don't see that constructive for the negotiations that are going on between the United States and Russia. Here is what Rubio said, Larry.
Well, sanctions are all the result of this conflict. They're sanctions that were imposed as a result of this conflict. And so I would say to you that in order to bring an end to any conflict, there has to be concessions made by all sides. We're not going to predetermine what those are. We're certainly not going to negotiate this today or in a press conference for that matter. But and there are other parties that have sanctions.
Sanctions are not the solution, are not helping us to negotiate. How do you see the way that Europe is insisting on imposing new sanctions and the United States not willing to get along with that?
Well, I just said, I'll repeat it, Europe can't meet itself coming and going, or it is meeting itself coming and going. I don't think they're going to get their act together. They don't understand what they're talking about at the same time that Trump is trying to bring a close to this theater of war. And I don't care what they personally think or what kind of politics they have invested in it. Their politics are going out the window within the next 6 months, some of them earlier than that. So I don't care what they personally or politically got invested in this deal with Ukraine. Ukraine's got hundreds of thousands of lives, and so does Russia invested in it. And we've been responsible for a lot of that, and it needs to come to a close. You hear that, Europeans? You hear that, NATO? You hear that, Brussels? And so let's do it as fast as we can. Now, I wish Rubio were saying the same thing, similar things about Syria. You know, we haven't lifted our sanctions there yet. And that is excruciatingly difficult for Syria to operate with these incredible draconian sanctions we have on them. Assad is long gone. Let's lift the sanctions there too. And Marco, while you're looking at sanctions, Mr. Secretary, maybe you could look over the other 2 billion people we have in the world under our sanctions, some of them incredibly crushing, and some of them, like on Cuba, as a state sponsor of terrorism, for absolutely no reason. They haven't sponsored terrorism if they ever did in 40 years. But that's Mr. Rubio's pet peeve, Cuba. You think we're going to lift sanctions there? Let's get smart, Mr. Secretary. Let's lift sanctions majorly around the world and gain some stature back for doing it.
Larry, it's so amazing to see CNN reporting on the support for Ukraine, that support that goes from the United States to Ukraine. Here is what CNN reported. And amazing how the reporter is the way that he's describing it. Look at it.
Zelensky will do the right thing when it comes to world affairs. Back in 2022, it was the clear majority, 72% through the floor. Through the floor by 2024, just 48% of Americans say that they're confident that Zelensky will do the right thing when it comes to world affairs. And GOP confidence has also plummeted dramatically. Now the clear majority of Republicans are not confident that Zelensky will do the right thing when it comes to world affairs. Really a real trend line, ones you rarely see in the American public when it comes to Ukraine and Zelensky. Confidence in both going down through the grades.
Yeah, going down.
I think it was Churchill who said the Americans will always do the right thing after doing the wrong thing 13 times. They're finally doing the right thing, Americans. Hey, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. He's dangerous. Let's get rid of him.
Yeah, the way that they're reporting it, Larry, it seems that all of a sudden Americans have decided to change their policy, but it has been going on during the conflict.
Yeah.
People were just changing their mind about it.
You should be here and see the way so many things are responding to Trump. I mean, they're running like scared rabbits with a steel shield over their butt because they're afraid they're going to be shot in the rear as they run away. They're scared. A lot of people are scared. Major corporations are scared. The stock market is scared. A lot of America is frightened to the core of what Trump is capable of doing to them. And many of their fears are just terribly exaggerated. Some aren't. And Elon Musk is wreaking a lot of havoc with those fears too. So you watch the mainstream media in America as it tries to figure this out and to get on the right side, if there is a right side. But it's fascinating for me to watch because I've been watching them do nothing but parrot the Biden administration for 4 long years. On Gaza, on Ukraine, you name it. They don't have any independent reporting.
What's so amazing about CNN, these guys are the same ones who were arguing that Ukraine is winning just weeks ago.
They don't have any problem. Monday, it's A, B, C, D. On Tuesday, it's D, C, B, A. And on Wednesday, they've forgotten the alphabet. It's whatever the power structure tells them to do. They're shameless. They're shameless. Just like, I don't know if you remember that mealy-mouthed, sleazy spokesperson for the Biden administration at the State Department for the Gaza situation. A lying sack of proverbial horse pucky. And is there any accountability for that sort of thing, Neiman? Not in my country. Not in my country. They go off and work for, a TV channel somewhere here, a radio station there, whatever. They continue. There's no accountability. You can lie through your teeth on mainstream media and there's no accountability.
We've learned from Poroshenko, the former president of Ukraine, that they're going to have a new presidential election on October 26th this year, 2025. And don't you think that if they want to have a serious negotiation with Russians, they do need to have a legitimate president in Ukraine if they want to participate in these negotiations? Because as we know, Russia was talking about this all along.
No, you're absolutely correct. They should have done it before now. And Zelensky should have been seen as the leading force or voice for that, because that's the only way you reestablish some modicum of constitutionality for Ukraine is that they have elections and they have a new president. I don't know why they're putting it off to October. It doesn't make any sense. It should have been yesterday.
Larry, the way that
if you were Zelensky, wouldn't you want to get this off your back? I mean, why is he so committed to what is a totally failed situation? I don't understand. Maybe it's the money. Maybe it's the graft. Maybe it's the power. But he now is presenting a picture of the world of a man who is slightly deranged.
maybe it's the British government who are.
Maybe they're promising him a dacha outside London or something. I don't know. But remember, this is the same guy who campaigned and won a resounding victory on making sure that everything was copacetic with respect to Russia. That is to say, no war, etc. That's how he won. That's how he campaigned. That's how he won.
Here is Larry. Here is what Stormer said in terms of the way that he sees the conflict in Ukraine.
Will have to do more. The issue of burden sharing is not new, but it is now pressing. And Europeans will have to step up, both in terms of spending and the capabilities that we provide. On Ukraine, we're at the very early stage of the process. Europe must play its role. And I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement. But there must be a US backstop, because a US security guarantee is the only way to effectively deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again. So I will go to Washington next week to meet President Trump.
So amazing the way that he's talking. Everybody's talking about negotiations and what would be the main article or the main conditions of this sort of negotiations. But the British government is talking about the aftermath of negotiations. We want to put troops on the ground in Ukraine, which was the main reason of this conflict and this war.
If Starmer could find enough troops to actually put them on the ground in Ukraine and have British insignia on their helmets or hats, I'd be really surprised. I was talking to a couple of people this morning about this very issue, and while I did not disagree with them that the British had the most professional army in Europe and NATO, professional army, it was so tiny that it would be lucky if it could put a division minus on the ground in Ukraine. And then it would have stripped Britain of everything that it has in terms of a military defense, other than the other accoutrements. And they don't have many of those either. I think they have about, the Royal Navy now is so small that it is not even a shadow of its former self. So Starmer talks idiotically. I mean, let's face it, he talks idiotically. And he hasn't been listening to Donald Trump, and he hasn't been listening to J.D. Vance and to Pete Hegseth, or he thinks he's coming to Washington and change their minds. I got news for him. He is not. But let's back up just a moment and let's look at what he's saying with respect to the wider tapestry that he's speaking for, even though he's not a member anymore. They're all falling apart too. Let's look at what's developing here now. You have got Donald Trump saying, and having said many times before in his first term, you need to pay more to be members of NATO. We're tired of bearing your burden. We might back out if you don't pay more. Threat, threat, threat. They are not paying more by a margin of difference. I mean, even though, who was it? Stoltenberg. Yeah, Jen Stoltenberg stood up at the Munich Security Conference, I think, or on the flanks of it, and started talking about how they were all at 2% or they were headed towards 2% and they would go beyond. Well, let's examine that for a moment. What Trump wants, if they go to 3 or 4 or better 5% of GDP, which is, again, no measure of a contribution. Anyway, GDP is stupid to use. because your GDP grows over time and you might have the same security commitments. So what does 2% mean in 2024? What does 2% mean in 2030? It might be double what you were doing at that time if your GDP is growing, which it normally does. So it's a stupid measure. Put that aside for a second. What Trump wants them to use that increased spending for is to buy American products like F-35s and F-16s and our Patriot batteries. Check out the European leaders. They want to make their own defense equipment, and rightfully so. They don't want to buy the equipment from the United States. Sorry, that's what Trump is talking about. He doesn't want you to just increase your percentage. He wants you to buy American equipment, make you even more dependent on the United States. That's one part. Second part, if they go to 5% or even 4%, bye-bye social programs. Bye-bye those programs in Europe, which from Denmark to France make the difference politically often, and certainly make the difference in people's lives, and make the Danes so happy that they become the #1 country in the world each year for contentment of the population. You're not going to do that anymore. So put that aside, because you can't afford those social programs if you're spending that much on defense. So see how preposterous this all is? It's preposterous. And what's it going to wind up boiling down to? It's going to boil down to the dissolution of NATO, the fracturing of the transatlantic link, Europe squabbling with itself as it tries to put together a European security architecture. And no way they're going to do that soundly, firmly, and with expectations for success in the future without Russia. Russia has got to be a member of that European security architecture. Do you think any of those leaders right now, other than maybe Orban and maybe Colin in Romania, if he manages to get elected, and maybe in Slovakia, I don't know, but do you think any of the rest of them will be in favor of bringing Russia into the new European security architecture? No, they'll be squabbling and fighting, and we're supposed to hate Russia, they will say in Berlin. This has not got good prospects for the future, Nima.
Larry, when he says we must put US-backed troops in Ukraine, we know that Donald Trump is not interested in Ukraine, but it seems that he's not interested in the European Union as well. He wants to withdraw the troops. He talked about withdrawing the troops from Europe as well, from Baltics. How is that when they see what's going on with the Trump administration and the way they're talking about Europe, not Ukraine, how he wants to put pressure on Trump to back his idea of putting troops in Ukraine?
I'm not sure I follow that. You started out European
Just
Union.
back his idea, because Starmer wants to put troops in Ukraine. If Donald Trump doesn't want to if he wants to withdraw the troops from Europe, how is that possible to put troops in Ukraine?
Good question. Good question.
That doesn't come
I'm assuming
together.
that Starmer's coming to Washington with the position that I want to put troops in Ukraine, and if I put troops in Ukraine, they have to be backed by the United States, even if the troops aren't in Europe. Ergo, what are you going to do? Now, there is an argument, and it's a huge argument in many respects. Ramstein Air Force Base is a very critical asset for the United States military's projection of power. And that's not just for Europe. In fact, it is less so for Europe than any other place. That projection of power is for the Mediterranean. We're building things, Nima, right now, much to the Italian government's chagrin a couple of years ago when they objected to it. We are building things in Italy, for example. We have things, as I'm indicated in Ramstein, that have nothing to do with NATO and Europe. They have everything to do with the Levant, everything to do with that little pipsqueak at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, that tyrant of a state called Israel. So what is it that is really important about NATO as NATO may become nothing more than a transactional agreement with Germany or some other state like Italy, where we have all these assets that are absolutely necessary for global projection of power. Read war with China, they would be essential. So I can see that devolving out of this, and we would make individual bilateral, more or less, relationships with some of these countries that have critical assets like Ramstein and like Aviano in Italy in them, which are not really there for NATO anymore. They're there for the Mediterranean and beyond.
Larry, do you think that NATO is on the brink of collapse
Yes.
with what's going on?
Yes, I said that. I said that 3 years ago. NATO has no future. It has no future for one simple, easy to understand reason. There is no threat except themselves. That's one reason why Ukraine is such a farcical situation, and why David Petraeus and a host of other American uniform wearing, star wearing military professionals were idiots over the past 3 or 4 years, talking about how Ukraine was so essential to the defense of Europe and so forth and so on. That is hogwash. It's not essential to the defense of Europe at all. Putin has no intention of going anywhere else. Putin did what he did because we caused him to do it. And we have been using that essentially to bleed Russia as we bled Ukraine viciously. And now people are beginning to realize that, to a certain extent anyway. It's beginning to dawn on them that this is really a very stupid policy. And I blame it principally on the neoconservatives in America and on the Biden administration's tolerance of them, entertainment of them, and having them in such key positions. That's what did this to us and to Europe. Now, Europe's got to pick up the pieces for itself. And to a certain extent, we do for ourselves. And Trump and J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth, to their credit, have at least in this matter begun to do that. I wait to see how it turns out because, like I said before, he had a marvelous thing going with Kim Jong-un, unlike any other previous president, and he screwed it. And he made a real mess of our alliance with South Korea. But the reason that president is in jail now, or wherever he is because he was the last vestige of people supporting us in a way that was contravening the real attitude of the Korean people. They thought Trump was going to bring unification of the peninsula and peace finally to a war that started in 1950 and isn't over yet. They thought that was going to happen, especially Koreans under 40. And he screwed it. He screwed it by coming in, doing what he should do, getting their hopes up, and then leaving. Let's don't do that with Ukraine, please, Mr. President.
It seems that in the eyes of some of these Western European countries, and in terms of leaders, not people, of course, but they were thinking that the conflict in Ukraine is somehow helping NATO getting stronger and getting closer to the United States, European countries getting closer to the United States. As the Biden administration was arguing this all along, that we are getting stronger, we are getting more united with European allies. And here comes Donald Trump coming in and just destroying everything.
Well, Nima, you remember that I was arguing that it was doing the exact opposite, and that we would see the exact opposite come to fruition in just a few short months. And that it's actually come to fruition before I thought it would. We're destroying NATO. If it was untenable to start with, once we passed 24, 25, 26 countries, it became untenable, absolutely untenable. Plus, there's no threat. So you just got a meeting house for people to jaw jack and to sell equipment, which is really what Washington liked. We could sell equipment. That's the reason we expanded. You know, Lockheed Martin wanted to sell all that equipment to lots more countries, and the only countries that looked like they might be vulnerable were in Europe. And so, we expanded them, and they gave a lot of money to Bill Clinton's campaigns. That's not a foundation for an alliance, certainly not one that had the foundation NATO had, which was essentially a cataclysmic twilight struggle between a monolith in Moscow and a monolith in Washington, with two diametrically opposed philosophies, economic and ideologically. Gone. And so it's all falling apart. And anybody with any brain would have known that it was going to fall apart without that threat to keep it together. And the problem now, and we should have started this much earlier. We started it in 1992 and 93, and Bill Clinton ruined it. We should have started disassembling NATO and reassembling something that would look like a viable relationship between Europe and us. And the most important part of that is to give Europe its own security identity, backed by the United States, particularly our nuclear umbrella, but essentially its own. Let them grow up, in other words. Let them grow up. I've said that about my Japanese friends for years now. You know, finally the Japanese started growing up, but one wonders if they're going to grow up properly given the time that they spent under our nuclear umbrella and essentially under our defense umbrella, particularly during the Cold War. The Japanese have very professional forces, very good Navy, very good Air Force, good equipment. They do a lot of it themselves. That's the Japanese way. But I'm worried very much about how they are going to handle being completely grown up. Are they going to build nuclear weapons, for example? They could do it in a heartbeat. They have such a complex. They probably have the most sophisticated nuclear complex in the world, with maybe France being right there with them. But they could build out in a year and be a complete stand-up nuclear weapon owning state with submarines, with bombers, and with ballistic missiles. Wouldn't be any problem at all. But I worry about that because we didn't let them mature properly before they get to this point. And they know that. And that's the real reason they haven't broken out yet. But, you know, the world changes, Nima. It changes, and you have to watch those changes and accommodate them, and particularly if you're a freaking empire bent on dominating everyone like we are.
Terry, if you were to suggest the Europeans, what do they need to do instead of just doubling down on failure in Ukraine, what would you suggest to them? Right now, they know how the United States feels about Europe and Ukraine. They know the first priority is not Europe nor Ukraine. And what do they need to do, in your opinion? Going after improving their military, going after their economy? Do they need more economic ties with other countries? How do you feel about that?
I think they do need to reevaluate their kowtowing to Washington over having limited economic relations with China. I think that's the future. And I think that's the future for everyone. And I don't mean that China dominates everyone. I mean that it's mutually reinforcing. It's a win-win game. But the first thing I would do, and I'm going to narrow it for you for just a moment, because this is my field. I'm going to narrow it to military matters. The first thing I would do, and I don't know if this guy Merz, who's the former BlackRock CEO coming in probably to be the new chancellor of Germany after the elections, I don't know if he has this skill or not, but I would convene in Berlin. I wouldn't do it in Paris. I would not do it in Paris. And people say, oh no, don't you remember World War II? Screw World War II. It's way back there. It's so far back. I was born in 1945. I'm 80 years old. Good Lord. Okay, screw World War II. In Berlin, I would convene a defense conference, and I would invite all the leaders of Europe of consequence and anyone others that want to come along and observe, like Estonia and Latvia. And I would say, okay, we are going to design, build, construct, put together, however you want to say it, a European security identity. And oh, by the way, I'm the new chancellor of Germany. By the way, I'm going to reach out there to Moscow, and I'm going to ask them to at least be observers as we do this, with the intention that eventually they will probably be a member of this new security architecture. Anybody got any objections? And start the process. Start the process. And in a sense, don't give the back of your butt to Washington. Just let them know what you're doing, and let them know unequivocally that you're going to do it, despite what they say. Invite their help if necessary, invite their attention, invite observers, but don't be beholden to Washington. Put together your own security mechanism in Europe. Establish the percentages that people have to contribute, all the things that go into doing that. Take a decade if you need to, but do that and let the world know you're doing that. And if somebody like Starmer comes along and objects, tell him, you're not even a member of the EU. Get the hell out of my shop, or whatever. I would be pretty brusque about it if I were the leader in Berlin. And I would let everybody know that this is going to happen, and it's going to happen on my watch, at least the start of it. I think that would send a signal out to the world, particularly to Washington and the other way too, that times have changed, that Europe has finally grown up. 740 million people potential with a $23 trillion GDP, annual GDP. We're going to get our act together financially, economically, socially, culturally, and most of all, security-wise. You can lump it or like it, Washington. You know, we won't like that. We won't like that because we have enough sense to see what a competitor that's going to be in almost every field of power. And, you know, that's the old heartland theory, you know. He who owns the heartland owns the world. I don't think that's very viable today, though, because the heartland is moving in toward Beijing. But I think if Europe wants to save itself and protect itself in the same voice or same word, it needs to do that. It needs to grow up. It needs to grow up. It needs to divest itself from Washington, not in a visceral sense, but in the sense of I am my own entity now. I can defend myself. I can do all the things that states should do without having to rely on you. I like the fact that you have 5,000 nuclear weapons, and maybe I could talk you into going down on that too as we meet and deal with nuclear weapons. After all, we have some nuclear powers too, France and Britain. Ooh. And maybe Turkey very soon. Pakistan is talking to Turkey about how would you like to have a nuclear weapon? Fidan didn't talk about that, but I read it between the lines and a couple of things he said. And I have some friends in Islamabad that I know from the A.Q. Khan days, the father of the Muslim bomb. And I know how they still itch to get the bomb out to more Muslim countries. I think they've already made a contract with Saudi Arabia. Should Iran get a nuclear weapon, even though it's a Muslim country, it's a different kind of Muslim country. And I think they've already made a contract with Saudi Arabia. The moment Iran is identified as having a nuclear weapon, 20 bombs will come to Saudi Arabia from Pakistan. And whoop, equality right there already off the bat. But I'm hearing that there are talks going on between Ankara and Islamabad also about that. This is not a good development, in my view. I think we ought to be going the other way, you know, reducing the number of nuclear weapons owning states. But it may be a reality.
Larry, we had Marco Rubio visiting Israel. Here is what he said during this visit.
Common theme in all of these challenges is Iran. It is the single greatest source of instability in the region. Behind every terrorist group, behind every act of violence, behind every destabilizing activity, behind everything that threatens peace and stability for the millions of people who call this region home, is Iran. And by Iran, I mean the Ayatollahs. By Iran, I mean its regime. A regime who, by the way, its people don't support. The people of Iran are victims of that regime. And so I think it's important to constantly point that whether we talk about Hamas, or we talk about Hezbollah, or we talk about violence in the West Bank, or we talk about destabilization in Syria, or we talk about any of these issues, the militias in Iraq, they all have behind them one common theme: Iran. And that must be addressed. And there can never be a nuclear Iran. A nuclear Iran that could then hold itself immune from pressure.
What do you make of what he had said?
A nuclear Israel that could then hold itself immune from pressure and conduct a genocide in the Levant. You know, a nuclear weapon owning state called Israel would be exempt. Blah, blah, blah. Listen to this. Single greatest force for instability in the Middle East. is the United States of America, not Iran. Who is causing the instability in the Lebanon? Who is really causing it? The United States of America. Right now, most vociferously and obviously and most disdainful to the world through Israel. But we use Israel. Israel doesn't use us. We use Israel to destabilize that region because, Nima, we do not like Arabs.
Larry, do you find
Rubio saying that? Rubio standing up there and saying that and looking like he looks and speaking the way he speaks is a travesty. As bad as Blinken's being Netanyahu's lawyer.
when he's talking about it's not acceptable Iran getting nuclear bombs? What does he mean? He talks about negotiation. He talks about going to war, attacking Iran. What comes to your mind when he talks that way?
Well, you know how I feel. I think I've told you that I think Trump has a deal in the wings, a better JCPOA, if you will. But let's parse it from Rubio's point of view. I don't even know if Rubio knows that, because Trump is famous for keeping things close to his chest or close to his Steve Bannon-like or Elon Musk-like advisors and not telling his actual cabinet officers. But let's just examine it for a moment. They are 7 days away from a nuclear weapon. They're at 60+% on enrichment. And the time between 60% and 90% and a bomb is only about a week. So if they were to make a decision and to go, they'd have probably 4 to 5 bombs within 14, 15 days. Believe me, I have been here with the AQCON network, with Libya, with South Africa, with Argentina, with other countries that were playing with that network, and some who were intimately in that network, like Iran, like North Korea, and who actually wound up either getting close, like Iran, or got bombs, like North Korea. And by the way, Nima, when Ye-gun and Kang Sak-ju in Pyongyang in 2002 told our Assistant Secretary of State with some laughter, he was promising them a big economic package if they would kill their nuclear program, that they already had bombs. You could have cut him, my mission just failed. We didn't know. We did not know they had bombs. So I'm saying that Iran, if it makes the decision, and I have talked with a number of Iranians, foreign minister, a president named Ahmadinejad in New York, and others in New York when they were here for the General Assembly. I've talked to them. I believe them when they tell me that they would operationalize their fatwa at the United Nations if we wanted them to, and sign it in blood that Islam abhors a nuclear weapon. But if you put them in the position where the people in Tehran, and they're going to move their capital down on the southern coast, did you see that? Smart move. But if you put those people in a room and you gave them their head, they would go ahead and build that bomb. And then Marco Rubio's got something else to say. Now we have 2 destabilizing powers, each equipped with a bomb. What are we going to do now? Because I think they would do it before we could do anything about it, before even Israel could do anything about it. I think they've learned enough to where they can be that secretive now.
And Larry, here is what Netanyahu said.
America stands shoulder to shoulder in countering the threat of Iran. We agree that the Ayatollahs must not have nuclear weapons. And we also agree that Iran's aggression in the region has to be rolled back. Over the last 16 months, Israel has dealt a mighty blow to Iran's terror axis. Under the strong leadership of President Trump, and with your unflinching support, I have no doubt that we can and will finish the job.
Yeah, we can finish the job.
And as soon as the first phase of the ceasefire in Gaza is in effect, I'll be finishing the job there. I'll be killing more babies and more children and more women. And oh, by the way, have you noticed that I'm doing the same thing on the West Bank now? Have you noticed that? I'm cleaning up. I'm really cleaning up. We're going to have, have you known I'm I'm flying drones over Syria, picking out new spots for my people to live. Wonderful, wonderful, Bibi. I should have said the most destabilizing factor in the Levant is our poodle named Israel. But ultimately, it's the empire. Ultimately, the empire is behind the whole thing.
Larry, it's so amazing to me that they're talking about destroying Iran's nuclear facilities. They know the knowledge is there. So what? You can just go hitting something and hitting something. They're going to build it again.
You're saying the same thing as a very smart Sudanese in Khartoum said to us in 2002. You can go to Iraq and you can seek out all their nuclear facilities, if there are any, their computers and everything else, and you can destroy them, but you can't take down the software of their brains. There will be some software in their brains, they'll be able to reconstitute the program. This is useless. You're just killing people for no purpose. He was right. He was right. If you want to build a bomb, and you're prepared to commit the money, and it is enormous. We even dissuaded Muammar Gaddafi to a certain extent because of the cost. The costs are just extraordinary. And, most countries don't have a closed system like North Korea does. The best description of North Korea is mafia. It's like a mafia state. It's a criminal state. You usually don't have that, even in a totalitarian state that, like Gaddafi ran. You don't have that. So it's a real decision when you decide that you're going to build a nuclear weapon and you don't have the GDP of a Russia or a China or the United States or India. Pakistan might be a little bit of an exception, except they were religious fanatics about creating the bomb. And they still honor A.Q. Khan as the father of the Muslim bomb, the Islamic bomb. So it's not a good direction to be going. I'm not trying to say that, but I am saying that I'm not so sure that deterrence wouldn't continue to work and work a whole lot better in the Persian Gulf were Iran to possess a bomb. I understand viscerally, I think I understand their religious objections to it. I've had the Quran quoted to me with regard to their objections. And I even said to a foreign minister who spoke English really well in New York City, I said to him, I think Muhammad would agree with you. Because I had just gone through the defense of a doctorate of one of my students who had written her whole paper, done her whole study on the Quran and on Muhammad's attitude towards women in particular, which was evolving even as Muhammad was living the last years of his life, evolving to give him women more power, more responsibility in Islamic states and towns and cities. And I think she was right. The people who came along after Muhammad sort of bastardized that, just like they did in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, it still won't allow women to be priests. That's the Catholic Church. The men run it. Well, the men still run a lot of Islam too. All that to say that I understand Iran's religious objections to possessing a nuclear weapon. And I think it would be with great angst that many of them would create a nuclear weapon. But at the same time, it could be inevitable. And there's nothing the United States or Israel is going to do about it. And I think Donald Trump, to get back to your point, Donald Trump is not at all intending to go to war with Iran.
Larry, when it comes to southern Lebanon, Israel is still there. Today is the last day of ceasefire, and there has, as ceasefire is getting to the final moments, there has to be some sort of understanding on the part of Israelis to withdraw their troops, their forces from Lebanon. But we know, just moments ago, I talked with a reporter in southern Lebanon. He said that Israel is still there in 5 points.
Israel will stay in 5 locations in Lebanon beyond the deadline, and to hell with you in Haaretz this morning.
What do they want, Larry? Do they want a new conflict with Hezbollah? They're putting a lot of pressure on the government in Lebanon. The government in Lebanon is trying to manage, but they're not capable of doing this, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think Netanyahu would like to finish off Hezbollah if he can. And I also think these 5 locations, if you look at them, I think at least 3 of them, possibly all 5, are designed to allow Netanyahu to tell the Israelis who still have not come back to their homes in that northern section to come back. In other words, we're here, we're going to stay here, we're never leaving, and we'll give you the protection that you desire so you can come home. Because it's making him look bad, making him look really bad. Particularly the fact that I'm told a lot of those people have left Israel now, totally left, and aren't planning on ever coming back. So he wants to staunch that. But he has not honored, as I've said before, he has not honored a day of the ceasefire with Lebanon or with Gaza. He's killed people every single day. Now, to be honest, Hezbollah and, well, at least according to Israeli intelligence, IDF intelligence, Hezbollah has violated it several times too. And Hamas has violated it several times too. But I can't find any concrete evidence of that. And I'm really reluctant to take the IDF or Mossad's word for it because I know they lie through their teeth all the time. But ceasefires don't mean anything to Netanyahu.
Just to wrap up this session, Larry, you talk about the situation in Syria. Who's in charge right now in Syria?
That's a big question. Lavrov talked about it a little bit, but Fidan talked about it a lot. And I took some notes on his speech because he's very good in English. One of the things he says was Europe is rediscovering Turkey. Yeah, you bet. Especially if they get a nuclear weapon. He said about Syria, U.S. withdrawal of troops from Syria represents that they are still formulating their policy. That was a kindness. We are still formulating our policy. We haven't even lifted sanctions yet. And I think the hint was there strongly that that was probably something we should do. And then he went on to say, in any country, we cannot have military or armed groups that aren't responsible to the country's government. Now, the United States is taking care of that. Turkey, he said, Turkey is getting ready to take care of that. I guess that means they've finished their work with the Kurds or whatever. He was hinting at the only country not doing that and even moving further and further in encroaching on Syrian territory is you know who, Israel. And then he went on at the end and he said, any country where we establish a reasonable amount of control cannot have any armed groups at all that aren't responsible to that government. So if they're going to push for that, if Turkey is going to help whatever government results in Damascus for that, then that would be a big boon. But the second boon that needs to happen is us lifting our sanctions. And frankly, Lima, I can't figure at all why we haven't. Especially if some of my friends who were telling me this are right, that regardless of the Al-Qaeda affiliations of some of the members of the current Syrian government, such as it is, are still on our payroll. I don't understand why we haven't done that. If we have them on our payroll still, is it for nefarious purposes that we do, and therefore we don't care about their being able to rule or govern in Syria? Or is it because we don't want them to rule or govern in Syria? This is really some nasty ground to go over. We have a terrible record, much of which has recently been exposed to me, of working with Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist groups, particularly in the Levant, and using them for our own purposes, almost the way we use Israel. for our own purposes. The fact that they are not states is inconsequential. They still are being used for our purposes. And then we cut them loose and rebrand them as terrorists and go after them, you know, whatever. It's really nefarious what we're doing. But I'm wondering, I can't calculate properly what we're doing in Syria and why we're doing it. Maybe it's because of the change in administrations. I don't know. Maybe Trump ordered someone to shut down the CIA and then he would review everything they were doing. That'd be a first. I hope he did do that. I doubt the CIA shut everything down because they know they can hide some of the things they're doing and they think they can get by with it until the next president comes in. I don't know. I really don't. But Syria right now, in many respects, is mystifying. I don't know what we're aiming at in Syria.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Larry, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Thank you for having me. If you figure out what we're doing in Syria, let me know. Give me a call.
Take care, Larry.
You too.